Good morning, everybody. Hope you're doing well and had a Merry Christmas and you're looking forward to the upcoming New Year with all the challenges that appear to be peaking ahead of us and yet all the promises of Christ that await us as well. We've been in a series for a few weeks on money and how it pertains to life in God. And so far, let me do a quick rundown of what we've learned so far. We've realized that money really does matter to God. It's central to the law of Moses, and it's central to Jesus' message because the love of money, not money itself, but an obsession with it, can consume us and cause us to destroy one another, as we're seeing in the world around us right now, while the love of God in our relationship to money can actually bring about justice, can bring about meaning and mutual affection. And we've learned that God doesn't want just obedience from us. That's not what he's looking for those who are in Christ Jesus. He wants all of us. So he has a purpose to show himself in our financial situation and through us, through our financial situation. And that being true, a loving God then could not abandon us to be controlled by our appetites. He will seek to reconcile all of us, the whole self, to himself. Now, we've discussed the fact that money, even biblically, is best approached not as a matter of legalism, though the laws can give us direction and can point to something bigger. It's not about mere obligations to God. That's not what he's looking for. If the fear of God is all that we can muster and we say it's a law, so I have to do it, well, I suppose that's a good start, but it's really not what you're being invited to in the scriptures. Rather, it's an imagination that you are being invited to, an imagination that's informed by love of God and one another. In fact, the law and the prophets, it said, all hang on these two commands, love God and love one another. So of course that applies to the Old Testament economic imagination, as well as the New Testament. What we see in the Old Testament is precisely this foundation of loving one another playing out in Moses' economics. We've looked at 8 laws so far, and we won't review them today just for the sake of brevity, but they have shown us something. They've shown us a world that we need to perceive, particularly in Israel, a nation where there is a father who absolutely intends to provide miraculously for his children as they mature in obedience and imagination like his, and who enrolls those flourishing children in the mission of raising up their struggling siblings as well. In fact, it becomes our chief concern is not acquiring achievement for ourselves or advancement for ourselves, but of raising up others around us, so far as they're willing. Now, today we turn our attention to what made Israel different from the nations around them. And their financial practices were a big part of that. So that's really what we're going to look at, how their finances were different from the other nations. See, God had called Israel to be set apart, in his own words, holy, meaning set apart, consecrated, special. They were his treasured possession, chosen out from all the nations of the earth, according to Deuteronomy 7, verse 6. In fact, their allegiance to Yahweh, as opposed to the other gods that the other nations served, caused them to see themselves as something entirely unique on the face of the earth. This is the way that Balaam, of all people, describes them in Numbers 23, verse 9. They are a people who live apart and do not consider themselves one of the nations. They're something distinct. They are not one of the nations. They are Israel, God's kingdom on earth. And the difference one witnessed in Israel was meant to be a witness, according to Isaiah 43:12, a witness to the nations that God dwelt here. And that's why Israel was to live differently. That must have tremendous echoes for today in the church. And how are we showing that God lives here? Now, we could explore this Old Testament theme from many angles. The laws we've already looked at showed universal dignity in Israel, regardless of your circumstances. It showed mercy. It showed mutual concern, which, if we look at the neighboring nations, was not the story we would hear. There was some sense of justice, but boy, it was barbaric and dark. But there were 2 important terms in Israel that appear frequently in the Old Testament: tzedek, or tzedek, and mishpat. Those are righteousness and justice, and we're going to have a look at them today. Before we do, why don't you pause and invite the Holy Spirit to have authority in your time together. Invite him to speak his words through you, to pray his prayers through you. And if you have musicians, or if you have music to play, do that now, as I'm sure you're in the custom to doing already. Remember to pray for our persecuted church of the month, which is China. So go ahead and pause now and do that. Now, if you have kids, and even if you don't, you know what you're doing. I want you to answer this question. When you think of the word justice, what comes to mind? The word justice, what comes to mind? Do you think it's possible that justice could be one of the most important aspects of life? One of the most important things to have in life? Why or why not? Go ahead and pause and address that question. So let's start with our first term this morning, which is tzedek. It's the idea of absolute or uncompromising right action. You might describe it as utter integrity, always doing what is right. And it's the most common term for Israelite morality and for what God is looking for from his people. In fact, it's even a frequent adjective of God himself. If you were to Google translate it today in modern Hebrew, you'd put in tzedek, and do you know what you would find is this, in English, justice. Righteousness and justice go hand in hand. But the Israelites had a word that explored our understanding of justice a bit more. It was a subset of tzedek. To be righteous would involve being mishpat is the word, being just, but righteousness was a little bit bigger than that. But I want to explore justice in the scriptures as it pertains to finances. And so there is a book of the Bible named Shoftim, that is Judges. It's a series of stories about righteous leaders God raises up in Israel to relieve suffering and restore the natural rights of God's people. That is, the Shoftim, the judges, produce mishpat, justice. The judges do justice. And those actually come from the same word. Shafat is a judge, Shoftim is judges, and mishpat is a participle, or a noun for justice, what a just one does. You'll notice that the biblical judges, if you've ever read the book of Judges, aren't limited to passing courtroom rulings. Okay, that's only a small part of mishpat, of justice. Justice is more comprehensive in the story of Judges. These leaders are active in 1,000 different ways in restoring the rights of God's people. Now, there are two foundations to mishpat, that is justice. First, there is fairness. God is no respecter of persons, we hear repeatedly in the Bible. All are judged according to what they deserve, according to their deeds, not their social status. All are to have opportunity. We've seen that throughout all the laws so far that we've studied, and they're to reap the rewards of how they use that opportunity. Those rewards are not to be withheld from them. But justice goes beyond fairness and qualifies it somewhat. You see, under mishpat, this idea of biblical justice, every single human being is allotted a certain dignity and rights from God, especially every Israelite. There are basic rights every person is entitled to put it another way. So no matter how the free market of fairness plays out, giving relatively fair playing field in order to achieve what you deserve, nevertheless, a just society ensures that everyone receives their allotment. And so your ability to succeed does not come without responsibility towards others. In fact, the modern Western sense of natural rights that is so prevalent, especially in North America, but all throughout the West, comes primarily from the Hebrew idea of mishpat. It's not quite as expansive as some people use the word rights today, and it's definitely more active. Here's what I mean by that. In the West, we typically think of rights as freedoms. Stay out of my way, you must not interfere with my sacred prerogative to choose. And there is freedom. There is an aspect of freedom. However, the Old Testament rights are not just the idea of stay out of my way, but they're at least as much and possibly more about what I owe to others as beloved bearers of the divine image. I owe them something simply for existing. In particular, the disadvantaged have an allotment from God that must not be kept from them. They have a right to live and to be shown dignity and to obtain protection that the community is required to extend to them. To that degree, freedoms are limited. Though you shouldn't immediately pick up what I've just said and suddenly insert it into your own political sphere, because you will be wrong. We'll look at that a bit later and how distinct Old Testament ethics are. Mishpat is required intervention on behalf of another. Look at the famous verse, for example, Micah 6, verse 8. I love this verse. It's actually the first song I learned to play on my guitar. He has shown you, O mortal, or O man, might be how you know it, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to do mishpat, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Doing mishpat, do you see here? It's associated with mercy and humility. It's not just having freedom, but it's leaning in towards another person in compassion. And this compassionate mishpat toward one another sums up God's expectations for it. I mean, Micah has just summed up what's required of humanity. Act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with God. Mishpat shows love for neighbor. How about Zechariah 7:9 and forward, which gives us a little further insight? This is what the Lord Almighty said. Administer true justice, mishpat. Show mercy and compassion to one another. Again, mishpat is tied in with mercy and compassion. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor. Do not plot evil against each other. Again, we see mishpat is associated with mercy and compassion and the refusal to wrong one another. I refuse to wrong certain people. In fact, any people. But Zechariah introduces us to specific groups that need watching over all throughout the scriptures. In Israel, 4 particular groups were named who required intervention to sustain their lives and to protect them from exploitation. And they were widows, orphans, immigrants, and the poor. The idea here was not guaranteeing equal outcome as much as we might be tempted to immediately interpret the law that way. That is not accepted by the law. Equal outcome is not the aim. But it was rigorously defending the lives of every human being and guaranteeing an opportunity to succeed. This is why James is able to describe true religion. He sums up religion a very complimentary way to Micah. He says it is to not only keep oneself pure from the essentially poison of the age, the impurity of the age, but to take care of widows and orphans in their distress. Mishpat takes care of the vulnerable. It takes them on as your burden. Mishpat was true religion. Mishpat, interestingly, is also how Job defends himself as blameless, even though he's suffering. And when his people say it's because you sinned, he said, no, I can defend myself. Listen to me, Job 29, starting at verse 11. Whoever heard me spoke well of me, and those who saw me commended me, because I rescued the poor, who cried for help, and the fatherless, or orphan, who had none to assist them. And the one who was dying blessed me. We could add that as a fifth. I made the widow's heart sing. I put on righteousness as my clothing, Justice was my robe and my turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I took up the case of the stranger or immigrant. I broke the fangs of the wicked and snatched the victims from their teeth. What is Job saying? He's saying, of course I don't deserve what's come upon me. Look at, I did mishpat, and that's what God requires of us. How did I do it? I took care of those 4 people groups. And he adds a fifth, and maybe you could even think of a sixth, the sick and the lame or disabled. And not only did Job resist the desire to exploit them, he actively intervened, rescuing them from the wicked. How does he describe this in verse 14? I put on Zedek as clothes. Zedek, righteousness. And mishpat was my robe and turban. Interesting, hey? And we're seeing that Zedek, righteousness, and mishpat, justice, have huge overlap. But again, mishpat, justice, is just a subset, a part of being righteous. Though maybe the most critical part in Old Testament ethics. Job had fulfilled God's expectations. He'd ensured that the lives of the vulnerable were protected, and they received the allotment to which all of Yahweh's representatives are entitled. That's every one of us. Deuteronomy, and this is the last verse we'll look at before we get to our passage today. Deuteronomy helps us to understand the idea of rights as a divine allotment a little bit better. When people came to sacrifice at the temple, a certain portion was always to go to the priests. And because they weren't allowed to own land or conduct business in many ways like their neighbors, it was important that they got their part. And so Deuteronomy 18 verse 3 puts this in a way that's so attainable as far as I'm concerned. God says, "This is the share due the priests from the people who sacrifice a bull or a sheep, the shoulder, the internal organs, and the meat from the head." That's the stuff that the priest was to get in order to sustain him for doing God's work. But that first term there, this is the share due. Do you know what word that is in Hebrew? I bet you can guess by now. Mishpat. This is the mishpat for the priests. That is, it's the divine allotment. I have set this apart for them. And what we're saying here is that mishpat, the idea of Hebrew mishpat, is that every single person, by virtue of being born human, has a certain bare minimum allotment that is required to be given to them from everyone who can afford it. They are your responsibility. Just being a human is enough that you have an inheritance on this earth. And as we find out in the New Testament, maybe we could say it by the end of Daniel as well, and in the life to come. Hebrew idea of mishpat. The person walking with God will not only refrain from taking that allotment, that mishpat, from another, but they will intervene to see that they get it. Now, again, before we filter all of this message through American politics and COVID questions, let's take a look at one example of mishpat in Israel, a more lengthy reading of how this worked in the law. So for that, I'm going to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 15, and I'm going to start with the first 3 verses. Deuteronomy 15 says this: "At the end of every 7 years, you must cancel debts. This is how it is to be done. Every creditor shall cancel any loan they have made to a fellow Israelite. They shall not require payment from anyone among their own people, because the Lord's time for canceling debts has been proclaimed. You may require payment from a foreigner, but you must cancel any debt your fellow Israelites owe you." So this is interesting. Anyone who belongs to this community is guaranteed forgiveness of debts at some point. The background here is that a person can be in debt. You know, this is not an economic system that keeps you from every financial turmoil or every consequence of your actions. As we've been saying all throughout, you can be in debt. But there is an aim in the law to end someone's losing streak and even to end someone's winning streak. Moderation, remember? And what's moderating us is the love of our neighbor. That's what moderates us. We consider them of more importance than our own bank account. No one should fall behind forever for making one stupid mistake or even a few stupid mistakes. Opportunity is to be restored. And so we see responsibility and mercy intertwining in mishpat. Responsibility in that you will face consequences of your actions. Debts are expected to be repaid. You're on the line for them. And yet mercy in that debts are also forgiven in time. Let's go on verses 4 through 6. "However, there need be no poor people among you, for in the land the Lord your God is giving to you to possess as your inheritance, he will richly bless you. If only you fully obey the Lord your God and are careful to follow all these commands I'm giving you today. For the Lord your God will bless you as he's promised, and you will lend to many nations, but will borrow from none. You will rule over many nations, but none will rule over you." That's a shocking statement that begins this, isn't it? Fact is, there need be no poor people in Israel. What does it mean then that Jesus will say a couple centuries later that you will always have the poor among you? Well, it's an indictment that poverty is not necessary, and yet it's always going to be with us. Jesus knows the nature of man's heart. Only the vice of those who rightfully impoverish themselves, and that does happen, and of those who exploit others is keeping people poor. This is true today, even from a merely natural evaluation. There is more than enough to go around, far more. No one needs to go hungry. And yet, what is it? Somewhere up to 30,000 people a day before COVID were starving to death. And today it's even more. Maybe that's not just starving to death, but dying of malnourishment as well. But a combination of those who have not giving, and those receiving abusing what they are given, is holding many in poverty. Once again, we notice that God's guarantee of provision is based on obedience to him. And he does promise, if you would only obey me, it's like he's pleading, and would you just obey me and I will show up? There's not only a natural observation, but a supernatural guarantor who says that we are the only reason we suffer as we do. God's words here give the accurate impression that even those who are currently successful are only so successful they're limiting themselves from God's full blessing based on their amount of faith or mishpat they are willing to practice. Why do that to yourself? Let's go to verses 7 through 11. If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards them. In other words, don't be so caught up in yourself and your own rights that you can't reach out to someone. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. Be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. The 7th year, the year for canceling debts, is near, so that you do not show ill will toward the needy among your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. They may then appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin. Give generously to them and do so without a grudging heart. Then because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in everything you put your hand to. There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. Well, again, mishpat aids the poor. Notice one is to lend and not to give. It's not that no giving was allowed in Israel. Of course, we've seen multiple examples that it is, such as not gleaning everything from your field. But one lends, and remember that will be without interest according to the law. You're also to risk that repayment may not be made. If you're in the 6th year and it's coming up on the 7th year of canceling debts, listen how he speaks. Don't have this evil thought where you say, well, I might not get paid back. No, take the risk and give the loan anyways. Deuteronomy says 2 things I find really interesting here. First of all, that giving a person nothing under these circumstances is not acceptable. Now, this is circumstances of a calendar, not so much of how a person is using their wealth. So that question stays open. If they're going to just waste this, is it time to give? And that question does stay open in the law. But the timing is not to affect it. And this really reminds me of James chapter 2, starting at verse 6. If one of you says to them, that's the poor, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead. This is something we have to get through our heads. Goodwill entails good action, not just good intentions. We've got a world hyped up on good intentions, and amazingly, it always seems to be good intentions for someone else to fix a problem. That's not good enough, according to the scriptures, not even the New Testament. James says, if your goodwill is merely good intentions and not good actions, your faith is dead, brother or sister. Dead. Boy, I got to stop preaching because this keeps convicting, doesn't it? Now, the second interesting thing that's said here is that the one who does not receive what they need from your hands has the power to cry out to God against you, and God will hear their charge against you. Isn't that fascinating? They have a right to what you have earned, even though it's not theirs. How in the world could that be? Because God has allotted a bare minimum that all humans deserve. And withholding it, whether you have earned it or not, is sin. Take that seriously. Because this idea of amoral capitalism, everything I earn is mine, is false. And no, the boundaries are not clear in the Old Testament of where that line ends, and it does. Again, equal outcome is not what the scriptures preach. And neither do they preach that under any behavior whatsoever you deserve your allotment. No, they don't preach that either. However, what you earn is not just yours. Caring for the vulnerable is to be done joyfully, we see as we read on. As though it's a privilege to have and care for fellow human beings, even if it requires something of you. Even if it places your ambitions as secondary, which it's supposed to do. And God once again promises to bless those who will do so. Would you just obey? And then God says something surprising. And it's not the first. I guess it's probably not the last, but it's still very surprising. Though he's already said there is no need for anyone to be poor, he now says just a few verses later, there will always be poor in Israel. Again, God sees the infidelity of human hearts. And this means that his commands in Deuteronomy 15, I want you to think about this. He's looking for it and he says, there need be no poor, but there will always be poor. He knows Israel will be a compromising people. So to whom is he writing this command? He is specifically writing it to the righteous people, those who will seek after tzedek, those who will seek after mishpat. And he's saying, so I'm laying this on you. The poor will always be among you because not everyone will be righteous, but will you? Well, let's go to verses 12 through 15. We'll finish up here. If any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, in the 7th year you must let them go free. And when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. This is why I give you this command today. Finally, mishpat involves responsibilities that run so deep that if the poor cannot pay back their debts, they are to be indentured servants for 6 years. This is not something you will hear a modern social justice warrior preaching, no matter how they try to turn God into their image and the scriptures to their message. Responsibility runs deep in the scriptures, and so does struggle. And it might sound terribly evil to you, being sent into indentured servitude. But what's really going on in these indentured relationships? Let's take a closer look. Once again, we have to say this is not the slavery we learn about in America, which was racially based and didn't have any boundaries. And furthermore, Israel is commanded not to exploit or indignify those who serve them. These are human beings, brothers and sisters. This is for a time. Remember that, because God will judge you for how you treat them. That's very apparent in the Old Testament. But one of the things I think we have to notice is that the relationship really isn't a tremendously profitable one for the employer. I mean, even if they get a full 6 years out of this, let alone taking someone in the 6th year with only 1 year to pay back the loan, I sincerely doubt that anybody, or at least the vast majority of people with any significant debt, would be able to pay it back by their work. I mean, the creditor or the lender has to house and feed and clothe, and we can assume care for this family that they take in every way. And then on top of that, in this culture, most workers were barely producing more than subsistence. I mean, that's why this person's in poverty, is because they couldn't subsist. So how much is a worker worth a day to pay off any significant debt? Instead, what this looks like is a mentoring investment on behalf of the lender. The servant, who presumably did not have great business savvy, will now learn how to labor profitably. Do you see that here? See, they're going to have to be coached along the way, because the lender's prosperity, as they take them in to work for them, their prosperity depends on properly training their workers so they're competent to produce profit. That is a training relationship. Furthermore, at the end, the lender is to give away parts of their flock and their grain, apparently giving the former servant the seeds of his next farming operation. Here you go, to get you started again. And on top of that, ensure that the family is well fed until the next harvest. Goodness, if you're trying to get rich, this is the wrong way to do it. This is not profitable, except perhaps for the debtor, who is set back on their feet, more ready than ever to prosper. One suspects this is more work to the lender than just forgiving the loan would have been. This is a mentorship program which the mentor carries all the cost in. This is Israelite mishpat, setting people back on their feet, as I've been saying from the start, preparing them for the future, even giving them the training to move forward. There is to be no class of perpetual takers in Israel except the truly physically incapable. This method gave opportunity to people, but it still promoted virtue because it required people to be responsible for their actions. So yes, you'd get a second chance, but now you must be virtuous, be faithful, be hardworking, be wise if you are to succeed. And the laws, did you notice, aren't all that precise either. So if you take in a laborer who owes you a debt to pay off the debt, the law never says how much their labor is worth day by day. And furthermore, when you send that laborer off with flocks and with the wine and with the grain, it never says how much. Why? Because these laws are not about meticulous calculation. They are laws about goodwill. They are meant to reorient us toward a proper imagination formed by love. And no law can replace a loving imagination. No law is thorough enough to replace the need for proper judgment on a case-by-case basis. I keep saying this. You cannot replace discernment and wise judgment with laws. They can only point the way for wisdom. But overhanging it all is the knowledge that if I am short with my brother who's come to work for me, I will face judgment now in a lack of divine blessing and in the age to come when I will account for all of my actions. So you see, biblical mishpat does not suit modern political debates very well. Both the political left and the political right have to learn from it and bow to it. For example, mercy is not to be offered at any cost. Paul will say, even in the New Testament, if one won't work, one won't eat. You can forfeit your allotment by persistent misbehavior. But at the same time, private property is not entirely private. You have someone else's allotment in your hand if you are doing well. And if you keep it to yourself, it will burn in your hands. So neither socialism nor amoral capitalism are satisfied. Then what should we take note of from the Bible? Why don't we make some conclusions here? Especially as this will be our last study in the Old Testament. Well, we might ask ourselves, number one, has our society created opportunity for everyone? Interestingly, the Bible does not think the whole playing field should be wiped out so there are no advantages. That never happens. Children of wise parents begin ahead, and that's not a problem. It's actually celebrated in Scripture. That's something that you can pass down as a blessing and an incentive to be wise. But it is assumed that substantial opportunity is guaranteed for everyone, namely in terms of land in Israel, which would always go back to your family, even if it was sold. And that the advantaged will turn in goodwill to help lift up their neighbor rather than exploiting their disadvantage for personal advancement. You see what I'm saying here? Is that the whole idea of the law is that instead of setting up laws to curb evil, our hearts are challenged to love good and love one another and treat one another right. You cannot legislate morality. You cannot legislate away your problems. The best you can do is curb them for a time, and we are seeing that in our society today because it will fall apart if we think laws are going to save us. Secondly, if the first one is opportunity for everyone, does our society meet people's needs? Again, it is not assumed, contrary to social justice warriors today, that mishpat is total wealth share or every want is met. But those who cannot care for themselves must have food, must have shelter, must have clothing, must have protection from exploitation, must have legal equality, and must be protected from physical harm. Those with the power to do so are required not only to abstain from performing evil, but to intervene to resolve and combat evil. Thirdly, this redefines religion for a lot of people. If you're a Christian today, you might have grown up thinking that Christianity is about what you think. Well, it begins with what you think, but it cannot possibly end there. Mishpat, tzedek, righteousness, is active. It's practiced in this worldly means, in concrete works. James says that faith without deeds is dead, and that the best way to show your faith is by what you do. There is no righteous person who does no works. Fourthly, and this will be the final one that I point out, true faith still does not show favoritism. Today there is a heresy called liberal theology, which is destroying the gospel, particularly in Latin America. In fact, it has heavy Marxist influence. And it says that God loves the poor and the vulnerable more than the strong. That is false. Israel, for example, is forbidden from favoring the poor in court, according to Exodus 23, verse 3. Just because a person's poor doesn't mean you weigh their testimony more heavily. Right is right in the Bible. Truth is truth. Mishpat is mishpat, regardless of social dynamics. We aim at absolutes, not relatives. And God does not love the poor more. Though he does avenge their plight when wronged, he does not love them more. Now, replace all those questions about how our society is doing on these issues and ask yourself how you are doing. Biblical justice revolves around individuals who do what is right and lift up the community, not primarily on state force. The state is at best a supplement and a backup plan to individual justice. And by that way, power remains in individuals, as God has always intended. God has always intended that the driving force in communities is their one-to-one relationship with God. Is your head above water financially? This means you have to stop passing the buck. Even if it's not above water, I'll tell you this, though the same commands and urgency on you is not the same, you're not helpless. You can participate. If you're in need, be relieved that God is your defender. But though there is a divine allotment owed to you simply for being human, assuming you're not actively working to waste that allotment, I want to tell you to be very careful in claiming someone else's hard-earned wealth as your own. That's a good way to fall into bitter entitlement, and let me warn you, it's a very good way to get your hand slapped by God when you assume that you deserve more than God has allotted. He is also the defender of the rich, let me remind you. Now let's conclude with a statement much like the one we made on last time we spoke on this subject. Christians have to have a better response to injustice and poverty than is currently there, and it begins with you. Justice cannot be forced on people. It has to come from the people. You are God's agent of repair. We cannot afford for you to abdicate your role for any reason, especially a sense of helplessness. The church needs to remember what is distinct about the church, that it begins with you, and that God gives promises to carry you as you act righteously, as you perform mishpat. The church cannot reduce its moral vision to what is legal or any of the godless political systems that are preached around us. You see, the Father is enrolling us to help his children grow and succeed, and taking personal responsibility for those who do what is right. He is taking responsibility. And usually that responsibility is to reward us financially for everything we put out. Sometimes it runs even deeper than that without the finances. This is a matter of love and imagination and cannot remain as law. So my question to you is, will you allow God to turn your attention, the attention of your heart, towards a higher priority than self-advancement, towards caring for the people around you and lifting them up with you? Each one of us gets to participate to whatever degree the Lord places in our hands on account of our faith. Because wealth is defined, you will remember, as the divine promise for God's children that you will have more than enough at all times to accomplish what he wants you to do. There is no reason to miss out on what he is empowering every one of his children to do. Let me just close with a personal reflection. I am where I am today because people have helped me. They set me on my feet when I could not do so for myself, and for that I'm tremendously grateful. I'm even more grateful because I can have confidence in the future because I know they are there to help again. On top of God's help, I know there are humans who will help me if I need it. However, I'm also where I am because there was a limit to how much people were willing to give. And their self-restraint, their wise self-restraint, helped me to grow into the relatively, because this is all what do any of us have that doesn't come from God, but the relatively self-sufficient person that I'm able to be today. And because of that, I've been able to partner in raising up others. I aim to do this for others, helping where there is need and restraining where there is need for their growth. Why don't we end with some questions in prayer? Question number 1. Did this study of righteousness alter your perspective on the kind of faith God is looking for from his children? This is what I mean by that. Does it recast saving faith in terms that are not just about what you believe, but how what you believe produces works that heal your world? And is that mention of works uncomfortable to you? Why? Question number 2. Be honest with yourself. Will God find you innocent of taking from others what he allotted to them? And moreover, would he say that you have actively intervened on behalf of the vulnerable? And if not to either of those questions, where do you start and what's keeping you? And number 3, can you see how these themes are being wrestled with in our culture right now? Where are their voices correctly understanding biblical tzedek, biblical mishpat? And where are these ideas being misused? Go ahead and pause and discuss those questions. Now, finally, our prayer list. I want us to pray that this study will have an effect on our hearts. This is the same prayer we've been praying throughout this whole course, by the way. That our hearts will be changed, our imaginations, our actions will be for the rest of our lives. That we will find freedom and purpose more reliable than wealth, but in which our wealth can be a tool to obtain greater things. I want us to pray for our nation, where so many people are torn by the master of money and other lifeless overlords. Pray for transformation as a people. And finally, continue to pray in this COVID season for diminishing numbers. We're seeing that in our province right now, but continue to protection in our communities, especially in our churches, and especially in Clive Baptist and Clive community, that God would protect our people and keep us healthy and strong. So go in peace, and I look forward to when we speak again. God bless.